There is a moment that arrives unannounced in every human life, a moment when you look into the mirror and see someone you do not recognize, not because your face has changed, but because the person staring back at you has become the very thing you once promised yourself you would never become. The antagonist, the obstacle, the villain. This is not a metaphor borrowed from cinema or literature. This is the lived experience of consciousness turning against itself, the psychological phenomenon of self-betrayal so profound that it rewrites the narrative of your entire existence. You become the author and the victim of your own tragedy. You write yourself into corners you cannot escape. You construct prisons from the very materials meant to build your freedom. Pause for a moment and consider this. How many of your current struggles are not inflicted upon you by the external world, but orchestrated by the hidden architect within your own mind? How many times have you stood in your own way, sabotaged your own success, destroyed what you claimed to love, or turned away from the very opportunities you prayed would arrive? The ancient Greeks understood this paradox intimately. They called it Hamartia, the fatal flaw, the tragic error that transforms the hero into the agent of their own downfall. But they knew something we have forgotten in our modern age of external blame and victimhood narratives. They knew that the most dangerous enemy does not come from outside the walls of the self. It comes from within. It wears your face. It speaks with your voice. It knows every weakness, every fear, every secret passage into the fortress of your being. Tonight, we descend into the shadow realm where heroes become villains, where victims become perpetrators, where the savior reveals themselves to be the dragon they sought to slay. This is Season 3 of our journey into consciousness, the descent into shadow. And this episode asks the most uncomfortable question human beings can face. What happens when you discover that you are not the protagonist of your life story, but its antagonist? This is not about moral failure. This is about the architecture of the psyche itself, the way consciousness can fragment and turn against its own best interests, creating internal wars that manifest as external chaos. This is about the moment when you realize that every relationship you destroyed carried your fingerprints. Every opportunity you missed bore the marks of your own subtle sabotage. Every failure contained the DNA of your unconscious resistance. We live in an age obsessed with heroic narratives. Social media has turned existence into a performance of perpetual victimhood or triumph, where everyone is the protagonist of their own redemption story. But what happens when the algorithm of self-deception finally crashes? What happens when you can no longer hide from the accumulated evidence of your own complicity in your suffering? The psychological literature has a term for this: shadow integration. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the terrain of this inner darkness, this repressed and rejected aspect of the self that operates below the threshold of awareness. But Jung's shadow is not merely the repository of our negative traits. It is far more complex and far more dangerous than that simplistic reading suggests. The shadow is the unlived life, the road not taken, the potential self that was rejected or denied. And it does not simply disappear when ignored. It grows stronger in the darkness. It learns. It strategizes. It becomes increasingly sophisticated in its methods of sabotage. Imagine a brilliant strategist planning your downfall. Now imagine that strategist has access to every memory, every insecurity, every trauma you have ever experienced. Imagine they know exactly which buttons to push, which fears to activate, which dreams to corrupt. Now recognize that this strategist is not separate from you. It is you. It is the disowned aspect of your consciousness that has been exiled into the unconscious, where it has been gathering strength and preparing its campaign. This is not mysticism. This is the lived reality of the divided self, documented in thousands of clinical case studies, explored in countless hours of psychoanalytic sessions, and experienced by anyone who has ever acted against their own stated values and wondered why. The villain in your story is not someone you became. It is someone who was always there, waiting in the wings of your awareness, rehearsing for the moment when circumstances would force you onto the stage together. Consider the executive who destroys their career through a single act of self-destruction after years of disciplined success. Consider the faithful partner who commits the very betrayal they most feared. Consider the parent who repeats the exact patterns they swore they would never inflict upon their own children. These are not random acts of weakness. They are the eruption of the shadow self, the return of the repressed, the revenge of the unlived life. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. The shadow does not simply want to destroy you. It wants to be integrated. It wants to be seen, acknowledged, given a place at the table of consciousness. And when it cannot achieve integration through healthy means, it will force integration through chaos and crisis. It will burn down your carefully constructed identity until you have no choice but to confront what lies beneath. The journey we are about to undertake together is not comfortable. It requires a level of honesty that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It requires you to suspend your attachment to your own heroic self-narrative and consider the possibility that you might be the problem you keep trying to solve. It requires you to trace the patterns of self-sabotage back to their source and discover the hidden intelligence operating behind your most destructive behaviors. We will explore how the villain emerges from the hero through a process of psychological fragmentation and moral compromise. We will examine the neuroscience of self-deception and the evolutionary origins of internal conflict. We will trace this pattern through mythology, literature, history, and clinical psychology. We will map the stages of descent into shadow and the potential pathways toward integration and transformation. But most importantly, we will ask whether becoming the villain in your own story might actually be the necessary first step toward genuine transformation. Because here is the paradox that Eastern philosophy has understood for millennia. You cannot transcend what you have not first embodied. You cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot heal what you continue to deny. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the guardian of your unrealized potential, the keeper of the energies and qualities you were taught to reject, the repository of your full humanity. And until you turn to face it, until you recognize yourself in the villain's mask, you will remain divided, at war with yourself, perpetually sabotaging the very life you claim to want. So tonight, we descend. We enter the labyrinth where the Minotaur wears your face. We journey into the underworld where every demon speaks with your voice. We venture into the territory that most spiritual teachings avoid and most psychological frameworks oversimplify. We go to the place where you meet yourself as your own antagonist and discover what lies beyond that terrible recognition. This is the story of how human consciousness turns against itself. This is the anatomy of self-sabotage. This is the psychology of the divided self. This is what happens when you become the villain in your own story, and why that might be the most important thing that ever happens to you. Are you ready to face yourself in the shadows? Then let us begin the descent. To understand how we become villains in our own narratives, we must first understand how the self divides in the first place. This is not a modern phenomenon. This is the original wound of human consciousness, the price we paid for the gift of self-awareness. When humanity ate from the tree of knowledge, when we became conscious of our own consciousness, we created a split that has defined the human condition ever since. Before consciousness achieved its current complexity, there was no internal conflict. The animal brain operates through instinct and immediate response. It does not question itself. It does not judge its own impulses. It acts and reacts within a unified field of behavior. But human consciousness introduced something unprecedented, the observer within the mind. The part of you that watches you think, that judges your feelings, that evaluates your impulses before you act. This observer, what Freud called the superego, what modern neuroscience identifies as the prefrontal cortex's executive function, created the possibility of self-regulation and moral behavior, but it also created the architecture for internal division. For the first time, a creature could be at war with its own nature. For the first time, desire could be labeled as wrong, impulses could be judged as unacceptable, aspects of the self could be exiled into darkness. The origins of this division can be traced through multiple frameworks, each revealing a different facet of the same fundamental split. Let us begin with the evolutionary perspective, then move through the psychological, the philosophical, and finally the mythological understanding of how the unified self became the divided self. From an evolutionary standpoint, the human brain is not a single integrated system, but a collection of older and newer structures that often work at cross purposes. The limbic system, sometimes called the mammalian brain, processes emotion, motivation, and immediate survival responses. It operates quickly, automatically, responding to threats and opportunities in milliseconds. This is the system that creates your gut reactions, your instant attractions and repulsions, your fight or flight responses. Layered over this emotional center is the neocortex, particularly the prefrontal regions responsible for abstract thinking, planning, impulse control, and social behavior. This newer system operates more slowly, evaluating situations through the lens of long-term consequences and social appropriateness. It can override the limbic system's impulses, telling you not to flee when you feel afraid, not to attack when you feel angry, not to pursue what you immediately desire. Already we can see the architecture of internal conflict built into the very structure of the brain. You are not one unified decision-maker, but a parliament of neural systems, each with its own agenda, its own timeline, its own values. And when these systems disagree, when the limbic system screams run, while the prefrontal cortex commands stay, when one part wants immediate gratification while another demands long-term planning, the experience is one of being divided against yourself. But evolution only explains the hardware. The software of internal division is written by culture, family, and early experience. This is where we must turn to developmental psychology and the work of those who mapped how children learn to fragment themselves. Every child begins life as a unified expression of need and desire. The infant feels hunger and cries. It feels discomfort and protests. It reaches for what it wants without hesitation or shame. There is no gap between impulse and expression, no internal censor editing the authentic self. The child is whole, undivided, completely integrated with its own nature. But integration cannot survive socialization. Every family, every culture has a set of rules about what is acceptable and what must be hidden. The child learns that certain expressions of self lead to approval, love, and safety. Other expressions lead to rejection, punishment, or the withdrawal of love. And because the child's survival depends on maintaining the attachment to caregivers, it begins the painful process of editing itself. This is not a conscious choice. The child does not sit down and decide which parts of itself to show and which to hide. The division happens at a preconscious level, through repeated patterns of reward and punishment, approval and disapproval. Gradually, certain impulses, feelings, and desires begin to generate anxiety even before they are expressed. The child learns to monitor itself, to suppress what is unacceptable, to perform what is rewarded. Psychologists call this process the development of the false self. The authentic impulses and feelings still exist, but they are no longer directly expressed. Instead, the child develops a persona, a mask, a role, a socially acceptable version of itself that can navigate the world without triggering rejection. This persona becomes so practiced, so automatic, that eventually the child, and later the adult, may lose contact with what lies beneath it. Where do the rejected parts go? This is the crucial question. They do not simply disappear. They cannot be deleted from consciousness. Instead, they are repressed, pushed down below the threshold of awareness, exiled into what Jung called the shadow. And here is where the villain begins to form. The shadow is not merely the repository of negative traits, though it certainly contains those. It holds everything that was too dangerous, too shameful, too socially unacceptable to be integrated into the conscious personality. But it also holds positive qualities that were rejected, creativity that was punished, confidence that was crushed, desires that were labeled inappropriate, power that was deemed threatening. Imagine a child who is naturally assertive and bold. If they grow up in a family or culture that values submission and politeness, their natural assertiveness will be labeled as problematic. Don't be so pushy. Don't be so aggressive. Be nice. Be quiet. Know your place. The child learns to suppress their assertiveness, to develop a compliant persona. But the assertiveness does not disappear. It goes into the shadow. Years later, that person may find themselves mysteriously unable to stand up for themselves in crucial moments. They may experience sudden, inappropriate outbursts of anger after years of patient compliance. They may find themselves attracted to domineering partners who express the aggression they have disowned. Or they may become passive-aggressive, finding indirect and destructive ways to assert their will while maintaining their consciously held identity as nice. This is how the villain develops, not through the accumulation of evil, but through the fragmentation of wholeness. Every time you deny a legitimate part of yourself, every time you force an authentic impulse underground, every time you betray your own nature in service of an idealized self-image, you feed the shadow. You give it power. You make it more sophisticated, more cunning, more capable of sabotaging the very life your conscious self claims to want. The philosophical dimension of this division was explored most powerfully by Friedrich Nietzsche, whose work on master and slave morality reveals how cultural conditioning creates internal fragmentation. Nietzsche observed that human beings naturally possess drives toward power, creativity, self-expression, and self-affirmation. But certain moral and religious systems teach people to be suspicious of these drives, to see them as sinful or selfish. The result is what Nietzsche called ressentiment, a deep-seated resentment toward one's own nature, a turning of life-affirming instincts against themselves. The person who has internalized slave morality does not simply control their impulses. They hate their impulses. They see their own desires as evidence of corruption. They experience their natural drives as threats to their moral identity. This creates an impossible situation. The drives do not disappear simply because they are judged as wrong. Instead, they continue to operate, but now they must work through distortion and disguise. The will to power cannot be expressed directly, so it emerges as manipulation, passive aggression, or moral superiority. The desire for pleasure cannot be acknowledged, so it appears as addiction, compulsion, or the voyeuristic consumption of others' enjoyment. The authentic self cannot show itself, so it communicates through symptoms, self-sabotage, and the mysterious ways we undermine our own stated goals. Nietzsche's famous aphorism applies here. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. What he understood is that the suppression of our darker impulses does not eliminate them. It drives them deeper, where they become more powerful, more autonomous, more capable of overtaking consciousness when our defenses weaken. The mythological understanding of the divided self appears across cultures and eras, suggesting that this is not merely a modern psychological problem, but a fundamental pattern of human consciousness. Consider the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where the respectable doctor creates a serum that splits him into two beings, the civilized Jekyll and the monstrous Hyde. This is not just a tale of good versus evil. It is a precise metaphor for what happens when repression becomes extreme. Jekyll spends his conscious life maintaining perfect propriety, suppressing every impulse that might threaten his reputation. But the suppressed material does not go away. It accumulates pressure. And when Jekyll's experiment gives it form, it emerges as Hyde, not just free of conscience, but actively malevolent, driven by the intensity of all that has been denied. The more Jekyll tries to suppress Hyde, the stronger Hyde becomes. The more Jekyll insists on absolute goodness, the more Hyde embodies absolute corruption. This is the fate of the divided self. The more extreme the division between the conscious persona and the shadow, the more violent the shadow's eventual emergence. The person who insists they have no anger will eventually explode with rage. The person who claims to have no desire will eventually be consumed by compulsion. The person who presents a perfect facade will eventually crack and reveal chaos beneath. In Greek mythology, this dynamic appears in the story of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and the dissolution of boundaries. Dionysus represents all that is wild, instinctual, and beyond civilized control. And what happens to the cities that refuse to honor Dionysus, that attempt to suppress the Dionysian impulse completely? They are destroyed by madness. The repressed returns with terrible force, overwhelming reason and order precisely because it was denied its rightful place. The origins of the villain within are therefore not mysterious. They are the natural consequence of a divided self, a fragmented psyche, a consciousness at war with its own nature. Every act of self-betrayal, every denial of authentic impulse, every choice to perform a false self rather than risk showing the true self, these create the internal architecture that will eventually turn against you. Consider the corporate executive who climbs to success by suppressing every impulse toward rest, play, or genuine connection. They exile their need for vulnerability, their desire for meaning beyond achievement, their longing for authentic relationship. These needs do not disappear. They go into shadow, and one day that executive will sabotage everything they built through an affair, a breakdown, a sudden abandonment of their career, not because they are weak, but because the shadow has grown strong enough to overthrow the dictatorship of the false self. Or consider the spiritual seeker who attempts to transcend all lower impulses through meditation, discipline, and ascetic practice. They exile their sexuality, their anger, their ambition, their ego. They construct an identity around being evolved, awakened, beyond the petty concerns of ordinary humans. What they do not realize is that they are creating a monster in the basement of consciousness. Eventually, the exiled material will erupt, through scandal, through the exact behaviors they most judged in others, through the collapse of their spiritual identity. This is not moral failure. This is the mechanical operation of a divided psyche. Split consciousness cannot be maintained indefinitely. The pressure builds, the shadow grows stronger, and eventually, the person who insisted I would never do that finds themselves doing exactly that. The person who promised I am not that kind of person discovers they are exactly that kind of person. The hero realizes they have become the villain. But here is the crucial insight that most psychological and spiritual frameworks miss. This moment of recognition, terrible as it is, may be the beginning of true transformation, because you cannot integrate what you do not acknowledge. You cannot make whole what you refuse to see as broken. You cannot transcend a division you pretend does not exist. The descent into shadow, the moment when you recognize yourself as the villain in your own story, is not the end of the journey. It is the necessary middle passage. It is the dark night that precedes a different kind of dawn. It is the crisis that makes genuine transformation possible. The transformation from hero to villain does not happen suddenly. It is a gradual descent, a series of small compromises and betrayals so subtle that we do not recognize the cumulative effect until we find ourselves in territory we swore we would never enter. This is the anatomy of moral drift, the psychology of incremental self-betrayal, and it follows patterns that repeat across contexts and cultures with remarkable consistency. Let us trace this descent through its stages, examining both the internal psychological mechanisms and the external manifestations that mark each phase of the transformation. Stage 1 begins with what we might call the original compromise. Every descent into shadow starts with a choice to betray something authentic within yourself for the sake of acceptance, safety, or advantage. This is rarely experienced as a major moral failure. Instead, It feels like necessary adaptation, pragmatic adjustment, the reasonable price of functioning in the world. The young artist who abandons their creative vision to produce commercially viable work. The idealistic employee who compromises their values to advance their career. The person who silences their authentic voice to maintain a relationship. These feel like small choices at the time. We tell ourselves stories to justify them. I'll return to my true work once I'm established. This is just temporary. I'm being realistic, not selling out. But something shifts in that moment of compromise. A precedent is set. The boundary between the authentic self and the performed self becomes a little more permeable, and most importantly, the shadow, that collection of disowned aspects, gains a foothold. It now has evidence that you are willing to betray yourself. It begins to ask, if you would betray yourself for this, what else might you betray for the right circumstances? Neuroscience reveals what happens in the brain during these moments of compromise. The first time you act against your values, there is conflict. Neural circuits associated with moral reasoning show high activity. You feel the discord between your action and your values, but the brain is an adaptation machine. If you repeat the action, if you continue to act against your stated values, the conflict signal weakens. The brain begins to generate new justifications, new narratives that make the behavior acceptable. This is called motivated reasoning, and it is one of the most powerful mechanisms of self-deception. The brain does not simply record reality. It constructs narratives that protect the ego from the discomfort of acknowledging its own contradictions. Over time, actions that once generated guilt or shame begin to feel normal, even justified. The gap between who you said you were and what you actually do widens, but your awareness of that gap diminishes. Stage 2 involves what psychologists call moral licensing. Having compromised once and survived the discomfort, having generated a justification that allows you to maintain your self-image despite the contradiction, you now unconsciously give yourself permission for further compromise. The logic is subtle but powerful. I'm basically a good person, so if I do this questionable thing, it must be acceptable. This is where the descent accelerates. Each compromise makes the next one easier. Each act of self-betrayal slightly adjusts the internal compass of acceptable behavior. You begin to notice that the things you once judged harshly in others no longer seem so bad. You find yourself making excuses for behaviors you once condemned. Everyone does it. It's how the world works. I'd be naive not to. Consider the corporate executive whose descent begins with a small inflation of quarterly projections, just a small adjustment to make the numbers look better, to keep shareholders happy, to maintain confidence. The first time generates anxiety, but when nothing terrible happens, when the adjustment is absorbed into the next quarter's actual performance, a door opens. The next adjustment is larger. Then comes the restructuring of accounting practices to technically comply with regulations while obscuring actual performance. Then the active suppression of warnings from auditors. Then the wholesale fabrication of results. At each stage, if you had asked this executive if they were behaving unethically, they would have generated justifications. I'm protecting jobs. This is standard practice. The regulations are unrealistic. I'm doing what's necessary for the company to survive. The shadow has now begun to speak through the voice of reason, using the executive's own intelligence against them, conscripting their capacity for rationalization into its service. This is the crucial insight. The shadow is not stupid. It does not simply tempt you with obvious evil. It uses your own values, your own intelligence, your own capacity for sophisticated reasoning to justify actions that serve its agenda. It presents self-betrayal as pragmatism. It frames compromise as maturity. It disguises capitulation as wisdom. Stage 3 introduces the feedback loop of consequence and escalation. The compromises you have made begin to generate consequences. Perhaps others are hurt by your actions. Perhaps you must lie to cover previous lies. Perhaps you must commit greater betrayals to protect lesser ones. The web of self-deception grows more complex. Now the shadow has additional leverage. You cannot admit your earlier compromises without acknowledging the harm they caused. So you must defend them. You must convince yourself more thoroughly that you were right. This requires doubling down, escalating commitment to the path you've chosen even as evidence mounts that it is destructive. This is where formerly good people commit terrible acts, not because they are evil, but because they are trapped by the logic of their previous choices. The husband who has an affair must lie to cover it. The lie generates more lies. To maintain the lies, he must become more distant, more deceptive. To justify the distance and deception, he must convince himself that his marriage was already dead, that his wife is the problem, that he is the victim. The shadow now controls the narrative entirely. The person who once valued honesty above all else has become a web of deception, and they genuinely believe they are the wronged party. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance reduction. The mind cannot comfortably hold contradictory beliefs. I am a good person, and I am doing harmful things. So it changes one of these beliefs. And because it is psychologically easier to change our perception of the action than our perception of ourselves, we reframe the action. What was betrayal becomes finding authentic happiness. What was theft becomes taking what I deserve. What was manipulation becomes necessary strategy. Stage 4 is marked by the emergence of the dark double. This is when the shadow has gained enough power to operate semi-autonomously. You begin to act in ways that shock even yourself. You hear yourself saying things you never thought you would say. You make choices that violate your deepest values. And in moments of clarity, you look at your own behavior and think, who have I become? This is not possession. This is not some external force taking control. This is what happens when disowned aspects of the psyche accumulate enough energy to overwhelm conscious control. The polite person who suddenly explodes in rage, the controlled person who suddenly acts impulsively and destructively, the rational person who suddenly makes an incomprehensible choice. These are not lapses of character. They are eruptions of the shadow. Clinical psychology has documented this pattern in what are called ego-dystonic behaviors, actions that feel alien to the person's sense of self. The patient describes feeling as if they were watching themselves from outside, unable to stop destructive actions, even as part of them screamed in protest. It was like I was a different person. I don't know what came over me. That's not who I am. But it is who they are. It is the disowned self finally strong enough to seize control. And this is the terrifying truth. The more you insist I would never, the more certain it becomes that one day you will. Because the energy of that denied impulse does not dissipate. It concentrates, it waits. And when defenses weaken, through stress, through crisis, through the slow erosion of willpower, it emerges with terrible force. Stage 5 involves the full inversion of identity. This is the point where the person no longer experiences their actions as contradicting their values. Instead, their values have been completely rewritten to justify their actions. The villain is now complete. They have become the thing they most feared or despised, and they have generated a comprehensive worldview that frames their villainy as virtue. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The Nazi bureaucrat who efficiently organizes genocide while seeing himself as a dedicated public servant. The cult leader who exploits followers while believing he is their savior. The corrupt politician who sells out constituents while convinced he alone understands what is necessary. These are not monsters in their own eyes. They are heroes of their own narratives, fighting necessary battles against forces of chaos, ignorance, or evil. The transformation is complete when the person not only commits harmful acts, but actively judges those who refuse to commit them. The corporate executive who now sees ethical behavior as naive weakness. The unfaithful partner who judges faithful people as repressed and dishonest. The propagandist who dismisses truth-tellers as gullible idealists. This is the final defense mechanism. Projecting your disowned values onto others as flaws while elevating your corrupted behavior as sophisticated wisdom. But let us be clear, this is not a story about a few bad people who descended into moral corruption. This is the story of human consciousness itself, of how the divided self inevitably creates internal conflict that manifests as self-sabotage and harm. Every person who has ever said, "I would never," and then found themselves doing exactly that has walked this path. Every person who has looked back at their own behavior with incomprehension and shame has experienced this descent. The question is not whether you are capable of becoming the villain in your own story. The question is, in what ways are you already that villain without recognizing it? Consider the everyday forms of self-villainy. The parent who swore they would never repeat their own parents' mistakes, yet finds themselves using the exact words and tones they most hated. The friend who prides themselves on loyalty, yet systematically undermines those closest to them through subtle criticism and gossip. The activist who fights for justice in the public sphere while treating their own family with cruelty. The spiritual teacher who preaches ego transcendence while operating from massive, unacknowledged ego. These are not hypocrites in the simple sense. These are divided selves, people whose shadow has gained control over specific domains of their life, while their conscious persona remains convinced of its virtue in other domains. This is how you can simultaneously be both hero and villain. This is how you can genuinely believe in your own goodness while causing systematic harm. This is the nature of the fragmented psyche. The neuroscience of this fragmentation is fascinating. Brain imaging studies show that self-perception and perception of others activate different neural networks. When you think about your own behavior, regions associated with autobiographical memory and self-justification show high activity. When you judge others' identical behavior, regions associated with moral evaluation activate. Literally, you are using different parts of your brain to evaluate yourself versus others. This allows you to hold contradictory standards, harsh judgment for others' failings, generous understanding for your own. The shadow thrives in this gap between self-perception and reality. It operates precisely in the blind spots created by your ego defenses, in the territory you refuse to illuminate with honest self-examination, and the more sophisticated your ego defenses, the more elaborate your self-justifications, the larger this shadow territory becomes. High-functioning people often have the most developed shadows because they have the greatest capacity for rationalization. The intelligent person can construct increasingly elaborate justifications for their behavior. The articulate person can generate compelling narratives that cast their actions in favorable light. The successful person can point to their achievements as evidence that their methods are valid. Intelligence and accomplishment do not protect against shadow possession. They give the shadow better tools. This is why so many stories of corruption involve highly intelligent, accomplished, initially idealistic people. The professor who starts with genuine passion for ideas and descends into academic politics and the destruction of students' careers. The entrepreneur who begins with a vision to change the world and ends up exploiting workers and manipulating markets. The revolutionary who fights tyranny and becomes a tyrant. The pattern repeats because it is built into the structure of consciousness itself. Consider how many revolutions have ended in terror, how many liberators became oppressors, how many movements for justice descended into persecution. This is not because the people involved were evil from the beginning. It is because they carried unacknowledged shadows that grew more powerful as they achieved power. The revolutionary, who has repressed their own desire for dominance, will wield power with twice the cruelty, justified by the narrative that they are creating a better world. The activist, who has denied their own aggressive impulses, will attack their enemies with righteous fury, convinced that their cause justifies any means. Nietzsche understood this when he warned about the danger of fighting monsters. The person who dedicates themselves to fighting evil without acknowledging their own capacity for it becomes increasingly monstrous in their methods. They torture in the name of justice. They kill in the name of peace. They oppress in the name of liberation. and they see no contradiction because they have become identified with their cause, their shadow operating freely under the banner of righteousness. This is the final horror of the descent. You can do terrible things while feeling virtuous. You can cause immense harm while convinced you are doing good. The shadow does not make you feel evil. It makes you feel justified. It colonizes your moral reasoning, your values, your sense of purpose, and uses them all to pursue its agenda of revenge against the conscious ego that exiled it. But here is where we must pause and ask, is the shadow truly the villain? Or is it perhaps the hero of its own story, fighting against the tyranny of a false self that denies authentic human nature? Could it be that what we call shadow possession is actually the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to force integration of disowned material, to shatter a persona that has become rigid and life-denying? This is the paradox we must sit with as we prepare for the final act. The descent into shadow, the moment when you become the villain in your own story, may not be a fall at all. It may be a necessary confrontation with truth. It may be the psyche's crude but effective method of destroying what is false so that something more authentic can emerge. There is a moment in the darkness that changes everything. It is not a moment of redemption or return to the light. It is something stranger and more profound. It is the moment when you stop trying to be the hero and stop fearing being the villain. It is the moment when the entire framework of hero and villain collapses and you see the deeper pattern that was always operating beneath these surface identities. This is not forgiveness. This is not moral relativism. This is not the erasure of genuine harm or the abdication of responsibility. This is something that most spiritual and psychological frameworks have not adequately described: the awakening into complexity, the recognition that consciousness itself is the protagonist of the human story, and it requires both light and shadow to be complete. Let us be precise about what this awakening entails, because it is easily confused with various forms of spiritual bypassing or psychological denial. The awakening does not involve saying, "It doesn't matter what I did," or "everything is forgiven," or "there is no good and evil." These are ego defenses dressed up as wisdom. The genuine awakening is far more challenging. It begins with what we might call the moment of total recognition. This is when you can no longer hide from the pattern of your own self-sabotage, when the accumulated evidence overwhelms every defense mechanism, when you must finally acknowledge, "I am the author of my own suffering," not because of a moral failing, not because of weakness, but because of the mechanical operation of a divided psyche. In psychoanalytic terms, this is the breakthrough moment when the ego can finally acknowledge its shadow without collapsing into identification with it. You see the villain you have been, and instead of either denying it or becoming it, you hold both perspectives simultaneously. I did these things, and these things are not the totality of what I am. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in consciousness without resolving them prematurely into false unity. Consider what happens to someone in this moment of recognition. The executive who embezzled funds, destroyed careers, betrayed every value they claimed to hold. Traditional morality would have them either consumed by guilt or defensive and justifying. Traditional therapy might focus on building self-esteem, reframing the narrative, but the genuine awakening requires something else entirely. It requires looking directly at what you have done without the protective filter of narrative, without saying, "But I was under pressure," or "But I was a victim too," or "But my intentions were good." Simply seeing, "This is what I did. This is the harm I caused. This is the pattern that operated through me." Not as confession seeking forgiveness, but as observation seeking understanding. What emerges from this radical honesty is not what you might expect. It is not crushing guilt or permanent shame. It is a kind of grief. Grief for the unlived life, for the authentic self that was buried, for all the ways you betrayed yourself before you betrayed others. And beneath that grief, something else begins to emerge. Curiosity about the intelligence that was operating through the shadow. Because here is what the moment of recognition reveals. The shadow was not random. It was not chaos. It was intelligence operating through different means toward integration. Every act of self-sabotage was the psyche trying to get your attention. Every betrayal was an attempt to shatter a false identity that had become prison. Every descent into shadow was an invitation to acknowledge what the conscious ego had rejected. The shadow does not want to destroy you. It wants to be integrated. It wants its energy and intelligence made available to the whole personality. And because the conscious ego refused this integration, because it continued to insist on maintaining a divided self, the shadow was forced to pursue integration through destruction. Think of it like this. Imagine you have locked part of yourself in the basement. That part does not stop existing. It lives down there in the darkness, and it wants to be included in the household of self. At first, it knocks politely. It sends signals, anxiety, depression, mysterious resistance to goals the conscious mind claims to want. But if the knocking is ignored, if the door remains locked, the intensity must increase. Now it starts banging on the door. It creates symptoms that cannot be ignored: panic attacks, addictions, physical illness. Still, the conscious ego refuses to open the door. Still, it insists, that is not me. That is a problem to be solved, a symptom to be eliminated. So finally, the shadow must break down the door. It must create a crisis so severe that the ego can no longer maintain its defensive structure. It must become the villain that forces the hero to confront what has been denied. From this perspective, every descent into shadow is actually a cry for integration. Every moment of becoming the villain is the psyche's crude but effective method of shattering a false identity. You cannot continue to live divided. The pressure will build until something breaks, and often what breaks is the carefully constructed persona, revealing the chaos beneath. But once the chaos is revealed, once you have become the villain and can no longer deny it, a new possibility emerges. Now you can begin the work of genuine integration. Now you can start to ask, what was my shadow trying to accomplish? What legitimate needs were expressing themselves through destructive behavior? What parts of my authentic self were so thoroughly rejected that they could only emerge through crisis? Let us take a specific example. Consider someone whose shadow manifested as an affair that destroyed their marriage. The conventional narrative might be, I was weak, I gave in to temptation, I failed as a partner. The therapeutic narrative might be, I was unhappy, I needed to honor my authentic needs. But the awakening narrative is different and more complex. The awakening narrative asks, what was I not allowing myself to acknowledge consciously? What desire, what need, what aspect of my nature had I rejected so completely that it could only express itself through betrayal? And the answer might be, I had made myself invisible in my marriage. I had so thoroughly prioritized being the good partner that I lost contact with my own desire, my own needs, my own sense of being a separate person. The affair was not really about the other person. It was my shadow trying to force me to acknowledge my own existence. Now, this does not excuse the behavior. The harm caused is real. The betrayal is real. But it reframes the situation from moral failure to psychological crisis. The shadow was not evil. It was the part of you that refused to die completely, that insisted on being acknowledged, even if the only way to be acknowledged was through destruction. This reframing is crucial because it opens the possibility of genuine change rather than superficial reform. If you see the behavior as a moral failing, you will try to be better, which usually means more controlled, more disciplined, more thoroughly divided. But if you see the behavior as the eruption of disowned material, you can begin the work of integration. You can ask, what does this shadow aspect need? Not what the conscious ego thinks it should need, but what it actually needs. The answer is often surprising. The aggressive shadow does not actually need you to become violent. It needs you to develop healthy assertiveness, clear boundaries, the capacity to say no. The sexual shadow does not need you to become promiscuous. It needs you to acknowledge desire as a legitimate part of human experience, to stop splitting sexuality off from the rest of personality. The ambitious shadow does not need you to become ruthlessly competitive. It needs you to acknowledge your own desire for recognition, impact, significance. This is the paradox of shadow integration. When you give the shadow what it actually needs, it stops needing to express itself destructively. The person who integrates their aggressive shadow becomes less violent, not more so, because aggression can now be expressed appropriately rather than erupting in inappropriate contexts. The person who integrates their sexual shadow becomes more capable of genuine intimacy rather than compulsive behavior. The person who integrates their ambitious shadow can pursue meaningful goals without the distortion of unacknowledged drives. But integration is not the same as indulgence. This is where many people misunderstand the process. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse. It means acknowledging every impulse as a legitimate communication from the psyche, then consciously choosing how to respond. The integrated person feels their anger and decides whether expressing it serves their values. The divided person either suppresses anger completely or explodes with it because they cannot acknowledge it as a valid signal. Neuroscience is beginning to map what happens in the brain during moments of integration. Studies of meditation and therapy show that successful integration increases connectivity between different brain regions. The prefrontal cortex does not simply suppress the limbic system. Instead, communication pathways strengthen. The emotional centers and the rational centers learn to work together rather than in opposition. This is what it feels like from the inside. You can acknowledge a destructive impulse. I feel the urge to destroy what I've built, without either acting on it or being terrified by it. You can observe the impulse with interest. Why does this part of me want destruction? What is it trying to tell me? And often the answer is that it is trying to destroy something that needs to be destroyed, not your actual life or relationships, but a false identity, a rigid pattern, a way of being that has become constrictive. The shadow is like a demolition expert working for the psyche. Its job is to clear away false structures so genuine development can occur. But if you do not understand its purpose, if you only see it as destructive, you will fight against it, and in that fight, you will become the very villain you fear. This is why the awakening requires what seems like a paradox. You must accept your capacity for villainy to move beyond it. You must acknowledge that you are capable of terrible things, that you have done terrible things, that the shadow is not separate from you but is you. Only then can you stop fighting yourself and begin the work of integration. Consider the parent who has repeated their own parents' abusive patterns. The conventional response is shame and guilt, which usually leads to either continued behavior, because the shame is so overwhelming it must be defended against, or superficial reform, behaving better through willpower while the underlying pattern remains unchanged. But the awakening response is different. The awakening response acknowledges, I have been abusive. This is the pattern that was given to me and that I have transmitted. The shadow was operating, but I am not only this pattern. Then comes the crucial question. What was I not allowed to feel when I was a child that would have interrupted the pattern? And the answer might be my own pain, my own fear, my own need for comfort. The abusive pattern persists because the parent has never been able to acknowledge their own childhood wounds. They split off the vulnerable child within and identify only with the adult role. The shadow then contains all that childhood pain, and it emerges in the form of rage directed at their own children, who trigger the memory of vulnerability that was never processed. Integration means finally allowing yourself to feel what you could not feel then. It means grieving the childhood you did not have. It means acknowledging the wounds rather than perpetuating them. And when you do this, when you finally turn toward the pain rather than away from it, something extraordinary happens. The compulsion to repeat the pattern loses its power. This is what Jung meant when he said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The transformation does not come through aspiring to be a better person, through positive thinking or willpower. It comes through turning toward what has been rejected, acknowledging what has been denied, integrating what has been split off. The awakening is therefore not an ascent back to heroic identity. It is a descent that goes even deeper than the initial descent into shadow. It is descending below the level of hero and villain, below the level of identity itself, to the fundamental operating system of consciousness. And at that level, you discover something unexpected. You are not the hero or the villain. You are the process itself, the consciousness that can witness both, the awareness that contains both light and shadow. This is what Eastern philosophies have been pointing toward with concepts like witness consciousness or the true self. Not a spiritual bypass that pretends shadow does not exist, but a perspective that can hold shadow and light simultaneously without collapsing into identification with either. From this perspective, the question, how do I become a better person, transforms into, how do I become a more whole person? And wholeness requires acknowledging everything, the capacity for creation and destruction, love and hate, connection and isolation, generosity and selfishness, not as contradictions to be resolved, but as the full spectrum of human possibility. What emerges from this acknowledgement is not moral chaos, but something like genuine ethics for the first time, because now your actions are not driven by the need to maintain a heroic self-image or by shadow eruptions you cannot control. They emerge from conscious choice, from the integrated personality that can access the full range of human capacities and choose appropriately for each situation. The person who has integrated their shadow can access their aggression when defending boundaries, their manipulation when navigating complex social situations, their selfishness when self-care is required, but these are now conscious choices rather than unconscious eruptions. The person knows they are capable of harm and chooses carefully, whereas the person who insists they are incapable of harm actually becomes far more dangerous because they have no awareness of when their shadow is operating. This is the great paradox. The person who claims to be only good will inevitably cause harm. The person who acknowledges their capacity for evil becomes capable of genuine goodness, because only the integrated person has real choice. Only the person who knows their shadow can consciously choose not to act from it. We have descended together into the territory most people spend their lives avoiding. We have traced how the divided self inevitably creates the villain within, how heroes become the agents of their own downfall, how consciousness turns against itself. We have witnessed the stages of descent and explored the possibility of awakening that lies beyond the categories of hero and villain entirely. Now, as we return from this descent, the question is, what do you do with this knowledge? How do you live in the world having seen the architecture of self-betrayal, the mechanics of shadow possession, the ways consciousness fragments and wages war against itself? The answer is not comfortable, but it is true. You live with the knowledge that you are capable of becoming the villain in your own story. You live with the awareness that the shadow is always present, always active, always waiting for moments of weakness or unconsciousness to assert itself. You live with the understanding that wholeness is not achieved once and maintained forever, but is a dynamic process requiring constant attention, constant honesty, constant willingness to acknowledge what you would prefer to deny. This is not a pessimistic conclusion, it is actually the beginning of genuine freedom. Because once you accept your capacity for villainy, you no longer need to perform heroism. Once you acknowledge your shadow, you no longer need to pretend to be only light. Once you recognize that you contain the full spectrum of human possibility, from profound love to profound destructiveness, you can begin to make conscious choices about which possibilities you will actualize. The integrated person is not someone who has eliminated their shadow. That is impossible. The integrated person is someone who maintains conscious relationship with their shadow, who can feel the pull towards self-betrayal and recognize it for what it is, who can acknowledge destructive impulses without either acting on them or being terrified by them. This is the goal, not to become better than you are, but to become more conscious of everything you are, not to transcend your humanity, but to fully embody it, including the parts you wish did not exist, not to defeat the villain within, but to understand that the villain is asking to be integrated, that it carries energy and intelligence that belong to the whole personality. The practical implications of this understanding are profound. It means approaching your own behavior with curiosity rather than judgment. When you find yourself sabotaging a goal, instead of simply pushing harder or condemning yourself, you ask, what does this sabotage serve? What am I not acknowledging? When you notice a pattern of behavior that contradicts your stated values, instead of defending or denying, you investigate, what disowned need is expressing itself through this contradiction? It means being willing to see yourself clearly, which is far more difficult than most people imagine. It means sitting with the discomfort of recognizing your own capacity for harm, your own patterns of self-deception, your own shadow's sophistication. It means giving up the comfort of simple narratives, I am good, they are bad, and accepting the complexity of consciousness operating through both construction and destruction, connection and betrayal, love and fear. For some, listening to these words, this is already happening. You have already become the villain in your own story, already descended into the territory of shadow, already confronted the ways you have betrayed yourself and others. The question now is whether you will use this descent for genuine transformation, or whether you will scramble back to the surface, rebuild the persona, pretend the descent never happened. For others, the descent still awaits. You are still performing the hero's role, still maintaining the division between conscious persona and shadow, still convinced that you are exempt from this pattern. To you, these words are both warning and invitation. Warning, the shadow you ignore grows stronger. Invitation, you can begin the work of integration now, before crisis forces it upon you. And for everyone, there is this truth. The work of integration never ends. You will encounter your shadow again and again throughout life, in different forms, with different faces. Each time, you have a choice. You can reject it, exile it, watch it grow stronger in darkness. Or you can turn toward it, acknowledge it, ask what it needs, integrate its energy into conscious awareness. This is the future of human consciousness, if we have one. Not the transcendence of shadow, but its integration. Not the elimination of our capacity for destruction, but its conscious transformation. Not the creation of perfect beings, but the evolution of whole beings who can hold their own complexity without fragmenting, who can acknowledge their darkness without being consumed by it, who can choose their actions from fullness rather than from the defense against hidden aspects of self. We stand at a moment in human history when this integration is not merely personal work, but collective necessity. The technologies we have created, artificial intelligence, social media, global communication networks, amplify both our capacity for connection and our capacity for destruction. They will amplify our shadows too, making the work of integration urgent in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. The person who has not integrated their shadow will use AI to pursue shadow agendas they cannot consciously acknowledge. The collective that has not integrated its shadow will use social media to enact its tribal hatreds and projections on global scale. The civilization that insists on maintaining its heroic self-narrative while denying its shadow will eventually be overwhelmed by that shadow's eruption. But the person who has done the work of integration, who knows their capacity for both light and shadow, who can consciously choose rather than unconsciously react, this person can use new technologies with wisdom. This person can engage with complexity without fragmenting. This person can hold opposing perspectives without resolving them prematurely into false simplicity. This is the invitation, to begin or deepen the work of integration, to turn toward what you have rejected, to acknowledge what you have denied, to recognize yourself in the villain's mask and discover what lies beyond that terrible recognition, to become whole not by adding something new, but by acknowledging everything that has always been present. The descent into shadow is not the end of the story. It is the middle passage, the necessary crisis that makes genuine transformation possible. When you become the villain in your own story, you are given the opportunity to see the architecture of consciousness more clearly than ever before. You are invited to question every narrative you have constructed, to examine every identity you have claimed, to acknowledge every aspect you have rejected. And on the other side of that acknowledgement, if you are willing to go all the way through the darkness rather than turning back at the first glimpse of light, you discover something extraordinary. You are larger than your heroic identity and your villainous impulses combined. You are the consciousness that contains both, the awareness that can witness the entire drama without collapsing into identification with any role. This is what the ancients knew and what we must remember. The journey into shadow is the journey into depth, and at sufficient depth you discover that shadow and light are not opposites, but poles of a single continuum, both necessary for the full expression of consciousness, both required for wholeness. So let us end where we began, with a question. Not the question of whether you are hero or villain, but the deeper question beneath. Who is the one who witnesses both? Who is the one who can see the hero playing their role and the villain operating in darkness and recognize that both are manifestations of something larger? That witness is what you actually are. Not the divided self, not the persona or the shadow, but the consciousness that contains all of it. And when you recognize yourself as that consciousness, the entire framework of hero and villain collapses. You are free to act appropriately in each moment, to access whatever qualities the situation requires, to be whole rather than fragmented. This is the return from the descent into shadow, not back to heroic identity, but forward into integrated consciousness, not to innocence but to wisdom, not to the pretense of being only light, but to the acknowledgement of containing the full spectrum. And in that acknowledgement, that moment of total recognition and acceptance of everything you are, something new becomes possible, not the transcendence promised by spiritual traditions that deny shadow, not the descent into chaos feared by those who have never done the work, but a grounded, embodied, fully human consciousness that knows its own depths and can choose its expression moment by moment. This is the technology of consciousness that humanity must master if we are to survive and evolve. This is the work that each person must do individually and that we must somehow accomplish collectively. To recognize the shadow in ourselves before we project it onto others. To integrate what we have rejected before it erupts in destruction. To become whole before the pressure of division tears us apart. The villain in your own story is not your enemy. It is your teacher, your guide into depth, the guardian of everything you have denied and everything you still must become. Turn toward it, acknowledge it. Listen to what it has been trying to tell you through symptoms and sabotage and mysterious self-betrayal. And in that turning, in that acknowledgement, begin the journey that lies beyond hero and villain entirely. The journey into the integrated self, the whole human being, the consciousness that can hold all of its contradictions and complexities and still choose love, still choose awareness, still choose to evolve. This is the echo of the ancients speaking through the complexity of the modern mind. Know yourself, all of yourself, the light and the shadow, the hero and the villain, and in that knowing, become free. The descent is complete. The awakening has begun. What you do with this knowledge is now yours to choose.